Hi. Our second lecture on socialization will focus on the sociological point of view, introducing some terms that became very basic to the symbolic interactionist approach to socialization. I'm going to introduce the concept of the looking glass self, and then go into George Herbert Mead's theories about the self and his stages of development. He did put a great emphasis on language. It'll be interesting to see that actually Mead was not a psychologist or a sociologist. Then I'll describe some of the contributions of two other sociologists who brought some interesting ideas to light about what we should be looking at. And last but not least, we'll explain the importance of socialization according to the three major theoretical perspectives. An important concept in sociology actually comes from Charles Cooley, who was a psychologist at the University of Chicago in the early 1900s, as you can see from the date. He gives us the concept of the looking glass self. Looking glass self is interesting. Looking glass was, at that time, the early 1900s, the term for a mirror. So we are looking into a mirror. We imagine how we appear to others. We interpret others' reactions, and from that develop our self-concept. Kind of have to think about this. So the child imagines how he or she appears to other people, not just the child, each of us, even at my age. And when I'm talking with someone, it's kind of like an automatic response that, well, do they understand what I'm saying? How am I looking? Am I being too bossy? Am I into my lecture voice as opposed to just a friendly conversation? So I'm trying to imagine how I appear to other people, interpreting their reactions. Just to elaborate a little bit, because I just love these pictures, where does the self-concept come from? Children learn how to behave within their families by watching how their parents judge their behavior and then judge themselves accordingly. So it's a self-concept, what we think of ourselves. So this looking glass self is going to be, this whole concept is going to be interpreted and put into a larger theory. So the person who picks up this looking glass self-concept, this idea, is George Herbert Mead. He also is at the University of Chicago in the same time that Cooley is there. And he takes this idea, he's a philosopher, he is not a sociologist nor a psychologist, but interestingly enough, it is his ideas that form the basis for what we refer to today as symbolic interaction. Now, what Mead thought, and I'm kind of condensing a lot of this, is that the self, quote, does not exist at birth. It's formed from social interaction. Now, he sees this as an active process. The child is interpreting at the same time that that he or she is interacting with another person. So that's what we mean by an active process. The person is actually helping to form their own self-concept by this constant interaction with other people who are around them. Okay? And again, you can kind of picture how the looking glass self is part of this. Mead saw two parts of the self, the I and the me. Okay? He saw the I as the active initiating part, which organizes the personality, and the me as the reacting part. Okay? One of the ways that I remember this is by a sentence which one of my instructors gave me many years ago. Think about this. Mommy will be mad at me if I take the cookies without asking her. So look for the I and the me in that sentence. Mommy will be mad at me. So me is reacting to the thought that mommy will be mad. Mommy will be mad at me if I, the other part of the self, take the cookies without asking her. So it's the I that is initiating action, is organizing the brain to take these cookies, but there is a part that is saying, well, but she's going to be mad at me. So you can see those two parts. Okay, what Mead develops are 3 stages of the development of the self. The first stage is what is called imitation and goes approximately from birth to 3 years of age. And again, these are loose boundaries to the stage. Some children may go faster, some children may take a longer period of time. But it is a process that a child has to go through in order to prepare them for the next stage. It is in this stage where a child mimics others. And Mead gives us the term significant others. I'm sure you've heard that term. Sometimes we use it today to mean those that are very important to us, our significant other, the person that we live with, or the person that is very, very important to us. Well, Mead used this term not quite in the same way. He used it as the people who are around the child, who are the caregivers, who are the people that are going to interact with the child, and the child is going to mimic them. Okay? At this point, the child does not see themselves as a separate self, but this mimicking or reacting is going to prepare the child for the next stage. The second stage is the play stage. And here, Mead emphasizes how important play is to a child. That children are acting out. They're taking the role of other people. So they're going out of themselves and they're going to act out relationships. And you do hear this or see this in children around this age, any place from 3 to 6, 7, that particular time period. And that's why so many kindergarten teachers will use this idea of the child dressing up, acting out, being a particular person, etc. It is what we refer to as anticipatory socialization. They're anticipating, they want to be mom, or they want to be dad, or they want to be a particular hero, comic hero that they have seen on television, whatever. But they are recognizing they are a distinct personality and they have a boundary of the self. Right now, they are working with the I of the two parts, the I and the me. But the next stage will give us the me. Remember, the me is going to react to outside boundaries. And so we need to have another stage in which there is some recognition that there is an outside world. The last stages that Mead talked about is the game stage. School years up until approximately about age 13. And again, I have to remind you of a historical fact that this is the early 1900s in which children as young as 6, 7, 8 even, but usually the early teens, were working. They were considered to be more adult than we would consider the teenage years today. So that's why the psychologists we talked about in the last lecture, but also the sociologists, are really limiting themselves to a very early, what we would consider still an early part of childhood. But the game stage is when the child is out into the world and it's organized play. They play sports, they play games in school, they're on teams, the famous dodgeball kind of thing. But they do learn that behavior is governed by the rules of the game of society. So take that example of playing organized sports and expand it to the society. And what Mead is saying is that society has the rules of the game. And you have to be able to take the rules and apply them to your life, okay? And it is in this stage where the child has the ability to take the multiple roles. if I do this, mom is going to react this way. If I'm playing a baseball game and I'm the shortstop, then what do I do if the ball is hit to the third baseman as opposed to the second baseman? And so there is this kind of an ability to put yourself into other people's situation and predict their reaction. This is what is called the generalized other. The generalized other is essentially society. Okay? And of course, the socialized self is the me part of this personality or self that Mead talked about. As I said, Mead was a philosopher, but his ideas and this idea of the I and the me and the self being formed from birth, not relying on a biological instincts that Freud was talking about. This becomes the basis for symbolic interactionists and their idea of socialization. Mead also stressed the importance of language. He believed in this linguistic relativity that we talked about under culture, that thinking requires symbols, it requires language, that in order for a person to know that that is a chair or that is a dog or a cat or whatever, you have to use some type of identification, and that allows the mind to start to have symbols, images, and begin to connect in a cognitive way. He says the mind is a social creation, which I guess is almost totally different from what other people might have thought. He says the acquisition of language coincides with the growth of the child's mental capabilities, right? Including the ability to think of ourselves as separate and distinct and to see ourselves in relationship with others. So the separate and distinct is the I, and the relationship to others is the me. Other people added some, of course, as the field continued to grow. An important contribution is from Lawrence Kohlberg. He asked the question, well, how do we know about values, good, bad, etc.? I don't think Mead really saw that as any different than as acquiring any other me knowledge. But Kohlberg spent a lot of thinking about how we learn good and bad. He saw three stages: the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional. Okay, the pre-conventional essentially is when the child is learning good from bad because bad has consequences, or each one has consequences, what we refer to as sanctions, that you're told you cannot cross the street, and if you do, you're going to be punished, okay? Or if you get good grades in school, you're going to be rewarded, okay? So that is essentially pre-conventional. Conventional takes into consideration other people. If I do this, I'm going to hurt someone else. And so it becomes a little bit more connected to this larger sense of the community. Post-conventional is abstract thinking. We do this because it is the right thing to do, but that law is wrong, so I'm going to oppose that law. So it's a little bit more abstract. Carol Gilligan brings another component into this idea of what makes us ourself. She brings the idea of gender. So far, we have really talked in very neutral terms. This happens to the child. Okay? But Carol Gilligan says, no, there's more. Gender makes a difference. Okay? Can this right and wrong that Kohlberg is talking about, can it be applied to females? Okay? She says, no, that males and females have a different perspective. They are socialized differently. And so again, she brings the idea of gender. So let me give you an example. Here we see an example of male and female crying. Crying is a physical act. I mean, it is a reaction that comes from emotions inside and brings out, tears. But which is appropriate for a male and which is appropriate for a female? And Gilligan points out that gender, which are feelings considered appropriate for each sex, whether it be male or female, and we'll go into this a little bit more in detail later with the chapter on gender. But she was the first person to really bring this out and talk about male versus female. Of course, in the whole situation about emotions, it's interesting to point out that emotions are socially constructed, that how we react to something is taught to us, that this is the way you should feel, and this is the way you should react to that feeling. So emotion work is the process of managing feelings, knowing what they are, whether you can create a public display or not. So emotion rules are how they're displayed, when they're displayed, and who may display them. Is it only children? Is it adults? Is it male? Is it female? So as we end this second lecture, almost end, let's say, how does this apply to Jeannie? Go back to our video again. We talked a little bit about what psychologists might say, and now we're going to talk a little bit about what sociologists might say. I have to say that for both psychology and sociology, this field of socialization has really evolved over the years, but we are talking about the basic tenets of what started this idea of how do people develop and what are the major differences. And I am taking the liberty to try to apply or think about what each one might say. What we definitely see in Jeannie is a lack of social interaction. If you know anything about the story, she was tied to the potty chair, and someone came in and fed her or left food for her, changed a diaper, whatever, and obviously they didn't change a diaper, but they did not talk to her. When her brother had these chores of taking her food, he was not allowed to talk to her. So there is no interaction. It's just take the food and leave it. So there's no mirror to reflect an image. If there is a mirror, it's a very cloudy one or just nothing there to reflect. Okay? So the lack of interaction. If you're going by Mead's stages, there's no imitation, there's no play, there's no games. She was not able to develop this thing that happens in the game stage, which is putting yourself into another person's position. What do we call that? We call that empathy. So she did not develop the empathy that allows interaction to occur. She has no social world. Mead might also mention the lack of symbols or language, which would delay the development of the brain in terms of seeing images and knowing what it is that one puts one symbol together with another, so cognitive thinking. Kohlberg would point out the lack of moral development, good, bad. That is something that she was not able to learn up until the time that she was discovered by the social workers. Later in life, her psychologist tried to bring her into his home, but because there was not an understanding of good and bad, he eventually had to place her in foster care. Gilligan might say that she is gender neutral, since there was never anything pointed out about this is what a male does and this is what a female does. So I guess it's kind of, the good news about that, but I think it was probably the least of the issues that we might consider here. So why is socialization important? I think it's kind of an obvious statement, but let's start with the symbolic interactionist, because that particular field did develop from a lot of work that was done with socialization. What the symbolic interactionist would say is you're not a person without the socialization. That to be a person requires this social interaction, particularly face-to-face exchanges. That's very, very important. This is a concern with a lot of the video gaming, a lot of the internet interaction, that it is anonymous. If you tweet, you don't necessarily have an exchange with a person on a face-to-face basis, and so that we are having a lot of different types of socialization occurring. Okay? And of course, they do emphasize language and symbolic communication. A functionalist and the social conflict people, both more on the macro level, but the functionalists would say, well, we have to socialize people, or we'd have to start all over again every generation to create a society. And so socialization continues the society. It transmits culture to the next generation. Social conflict people, of course, would tell us it reproduces the inequality and point out, I think is a very significant thing, that there's different socialization for different categories of our society. There's a different socialization for the rich as opposed to the poor, males versus females, certain social classes. We'll see a little bit of that as we continue in the next unit where we talk about inequality. All right, but socialization has become, this whole field is very important in education, in child rearing. We never teach anybody how to be a parent. We just say go out and have children and assume that everybody knows how to do it. But this process of socialization is an extremely important thing for parenting and for people to understand. Okay, in this lecture we have looked at sociology and their approach to socialization. Sociology sees the self develop through a process of stages of social interaction. The looking glass self is our interpretation of how others react to us. And this looking glass self is a concept given to us by Kohlberg, and it forms the basis for Mead's theory. Mead's theory is stages, and this theory formed the basis of symbolic interaction thought on socialization. Kohlberg introduced socialization of values, and Gilligan pointed out different socialization for males and females, and eventually for other categories too. So we will continue to look at socialization. There's one more lecture, but that will be next week.